Neiman, Brian Wilson, Mary Catherine Ham, today's newsmakers, and you. The Morning Majority, 630.
WMAL. 8:37 on WMAL, and we have Larry Kudlow of CNBC fame with us, of the Kudlow Report. How you doing, Larry?
Hey, Mary Catherine.
Hey, so what did you make of the president's press conference and his message and where we're headed on this debt limit talk?
Well, I mean, what I make of it is there's no deal right now. And there's a lot of issues going on here. One of them is the spending cuts. This is the way I look at it. You're talking about spending cuts over, I guess, 10 years. The only spending cut that matters is this coming year, fiscal 2012. And I know you said that last night, and you're correct. I wrote an article about this.
Thank you very much.
The only spending cut that matters that could possibly bring the baseline lower. I mean, spending always rises because these current services baselines always rise from inflation and population. Therefore, if you want to really lower spending for 10 years, start with the next year, not the out years. The out years will never be realized. The only thing that matters is this year, and they've got to take $100 billion at least out of the 2012 baseline. That's not the entitlements. That's the discretionary. They have to do that. So that's point number one. Point number two is taxes on taxes. We're still dickering over tax increases on top of already scheduled future tax increases, which is nuts for the economy. And the third point I'll say is, quickly, I'm interested, okay, I'm open-minded on Obama's entitlement initiatives, okay? There may be something there, cost of living adjustments, extending the retirement age, some other issues on Medicare. Maybe there's something there that's worth talking about. I'm not sure, but I think he put that out yesterday.
All right, Larry, let's just get down to brass tacks here. Handicap this thing for me. Is there going to be a deal, or is there going to be no deal?
There'll be a deal.
And
There'll be a deal.
Will it be a small deal? A small deal?
I'm leaning towards a small deal, but what do I know? I'm not in the room. I mean, pundits, there's people in the room, out of the room, watching speculation. They're saying $2 trillion. I have no idea. I truly have no idea.
Well,
but I don't think. I interviewed Michelle Bachmann last night, and I really don't think you can leave this to no deal with revenues covering interest on the debt and then covering whatever else is left over. I just don't. I think that's very unwieldy. I think the polls, by the way, the people do not want a deal, but I think it would be no deal would be very bad for the United States.
I want to pick up the point you talked about and what Mary Catherine was arguing last night with Bill O'Reilly in this idea of the word cut, when we're not really cutting.
We don't cut.
All right, and you wrote about this. And can you?
We don't cut. I showed you the two. I showed you the Ryan baseline, and I showed you the Obama baseline in that article. I just wrote that just for the heck of it because I'm an old OMB green eye shade. The lines, we're going to spend $45 trillion in the next 10 years.
But tell our audience the analogy used with buying the Mercedes versus the Chevy.
I mean, right.
That's important.
If a family goes out and wants to buy a $100,000 Mercedes, God bless them, if that's what they want, then they go and actually look at it and see it, and they decide to buy a $20,000 Chevy. Congress scores that as an $80,000 budget cut.
Right.
A family would say we just spent $20,000. Right. That's the difference. So if you're going to spend $45 trillion over the next 10 years, and you slow that machine down and you only spend $40 trillion, okay, that's good. But that's not a $5 trillion budget cut. That's a $40 trillion spending increase. Let's call it what it is. And the way you can deal with that is by bending the cost curve down at the beginning of the period, namely the next fiscal year. And I can't find anybody to tell me or answer my question, how much are you going to take out of the 2012 baseline? That's the fiscal year that begins October 1st. We don't have a budget. The House has a budget, the Ryan budget. He would take about $120 billion out of the CBO baseline. The Senate doesn't do budgeting anymore, the Democrats in the Senate, and the administration doesn't have a budget. And I'd like to have that question answered before any deal is set.
Well, this is more a statement than a question, but that's what scares me about this process. There's so much squealing, and it's the end of the world about maybe cutting or promising to cut in the future the speed of growth. And it's like our problem's way bigger than that.
Right, way bigger than that. Now, I will say this. There are some interesting thoughts on the table regarding entitlements, all right? the chained CPI cost of living adjustment is an interesting thought, and that should be discussed. Raising the retirement age, the eligibility age, is an interesting thought. There's also looming out there very large-scale budget cuts for Medicare, mostly from the hospitals and doctors. I don't know if that can pass. That's an interesting thought. In other words, there are entitlement reforms on the table that should be dealt with. Someone's got to look at that and say, is this worth it? And see if there's a deal. I don't know if there's a deal. Maybe there is.
I asked GBP this earlier today. Wall Street seems to be quiet on all this. They're not talking one way or the other saying, hey, you better have something in place by August 2nd, and they're not saying, don't worry about it. Why do you think the Wall Street has been so quiet on this particular fight?
The bond market is under the influence of the economy, which is very, very soft. That's probably the biggest driver of rates, which are low. The 10-year Treasury is, about 2.95? It's under 3%. So it's not worried just yet. Some people on Wall Street, there are Cassandra voices about default. So far, the market is not dealing with that. There's a little more complicated calculation called credit default swaps, which have widened recently on the U.S. Treasury, which are warning about the default situation. I think that mostly the bond market doesn't truly believe we're going to default. That's what I think right now. But these things could reverse very quickly. Geithner is out there, singing the siren song, and on the whole, although I don't like Geithner's positions on the clean debt bill and whatnot, I think it's not a good idea for us to tempt fate. I think it's not a good idea, and I think the viewpoint coming from Ms. Bachmann and some others that we have enough revenues to pay off the interest on the debt, that is true, but I don't think that's a very good way to run the railroad, and I think the pain for deep budget cuts willy-nilly, that's not the right way to do this, even though I'm a budget cutter. So, I think a deal is preferable, but it's got to be a good deal.
All right, Larry Kudlow, thank you for the insight. We'll be checking back in with you to see how this thing unfolds.